Hey everyone, I'm Katie, the host of the podcast Yapping About History. This week we're going to be talking about the book The Widow Clicquot, written by Talar Mazzeo, and it is about Barbe-Nicole Clicquot, a woman who took over her husband's wine business after he passed in the late 1700s. And it's about her life and how she brought this champagne house to the international fame that it is known for today. And I thought, what better way of talking about her life and her champagne than by enjoying a glass of the champagne itself? So here we are. She talks to an expert in the back of the book who suggests the best way to open a bottle of champagne. And they said to have it chilling in a bucket of half ice, half water for at least 30 minutes. So that has been done already. And then once you take the cage off, you hold the cork and slowly spin the bottle around. And that should uh, prevent the cork from popping and from any of the champagne spilling out. So that's what I'm going to attempt to do right now. I am scared of champagne bottles. So we'll see. Oh, interesting note, the anchor symbols here and here are part of the original design from the late 1700s. Okay. Oh, that's so cute. It's got her portrait. I don't know if you can see it. I'm scared. It has her portrait. That's the Widow Clicquot. Here we go. Oh, well, did pop, but the champagne didn't come out. I did have a towel off. Oh, you can see it in the shot. Oh, my heart is racing. That was scary. Okay, I also don't really know how to pour champagne, so but cheers, everybody. Here we go. Bubbles. The original champagne flutes, like the cups that you see, were supposedly designed after the King Louis's mistress, Pompadour's breasts. So there's a little fun fact for you. All right, I think that's good. All right. So cheers to Barbe-Nicole Clicquot, and I hope you join us for this week's episode. Cheers. Refreshing. Hey everyone, welcome back. I'm Katie, and this is Yapping About History. I've got a couple announcements. The first one you might already know, but we've got a name change alert. Woo! That's right. I changed it to Yapping About History because I realized after a few episodes that I wanted to focus solely on history. And, since it is my podcast, I have the right to change it back if I want to go broader. But that's one of those things, action clarity comes with action. And so I didn't really know if I wanted to do multiple topics, but as I've gone through, I realized I want to focus on history. So I'm changing the podcast name to Yapping About History. And second surprise, you might not know if you're listening like a regular podcaster, but this is the first episode with video. Woo! And that'll be on YouTube. So check that out. And I'll be putting clips out on social media, on TikTok and Instagram. Those will be linked in the episode description. But I wanted to start with a video because our alcohol and history series, I thought it would be fun to have the actual alcohol we're talking about. And so like the last episode when I had the Genesee beer, I didn't record that, but I think I'll go back and record some video clips because I do have an extra Genesee beer in the fridge. But this week, I don't know how I'm gonna splice it because I kind of did a little promo, but we are talking about the Widow Clicquot. The main source for this is the book called The Widow Clicquot. It was written by Talar Mazzeo, and it is about the life of Barbe-Nicole Clicquot, who took over her husband's wine business in the late 1700s and brought it to international fame and renown. And it is still a very popular champagne brand to this day. Even if you don't drink champagne, I feel like it is a very popular bottle, the yellow label, and we've got it here. So that's what I did in the opener. I opened this up live. Hopefully, that's some good ASMR. And I poured myself a glass. Hopefully, can we see this in the shot? Let's check. Yeah, you can see it. It's on my bar cart. Woohoo, let's twist it. And we've got my champagne here. Look at these little cutie glasses. Oh. All right. So now we've established our drinks. Let's get into it. So this book was written in 2008, and at that time, only one woman was running a major champagne house, and that was the Widow Clicquot Champagne House. In French, it's Veuve. Sorry for the pronunciation, but it's known as the Veuve Clicquot. This woman is named Madame Cecil Boniford, and she ran Veuve Clicquot from 2001 to 2010. She was the first female president of Veuve Clicquot since Barbe-Nicole herself. Um, bum, 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 bum. But it's still considered a man's world, and there's very few women who hold senior positions even to this day. But let's get into Barbe-Nicole's life. She was only 11 when the French Revolution started in 1789. She was living and going to school at a prestigious royal convent, which is where the rich and royal families sent their daughters. Her dad was one of the city's, they lived in the city of Reims. He was one of the wealthiest and most important businessmen there, and their family was also Catholic, which was not a good look to have, both being wealthy and Catholic at the beginning of the revolution. And just for context, Reims is located in the Champagne region of France, which is in the northeastern part of the country. We're not going to really go into the details of the French Revolution, but it's classic revolution where the lower class finally gets fed up after hundreds of years of poverty while the rich get richer. And spoiler alert, Barbe-Nicole lives a very long life and sees France go through multiple revolutions and wars. According to mostly what would be considered family legend, her parents had a dressmaker go to the convent where Barbe-Nicole was going to school and living to sneak her out because the convent would likely be a target for the mob that was growing around the city. The dressmaker brought peasant clothes for Barbe-Nicole to wear, and then they snuck out unnoticed, and Barbe-Nicole actually lived with the dressmaker for a while until they deemed it safe to be with the rest of her family. And this is sadly the only story from her childhood that survives, and some even argue whether or not this was really her or her sister who were rescued from the convent. But the author, Mazzeo, makes a good point. She writes, quote, "This silence might be the most important order of her story. Like other girls from privileged genteel families of the time, she was meant to be invisible. Had everything gone to plan, Barbe-Nicole would have lived and died in relative anonymity." End quote. She later writes that the only women who had reputations at this time or who were known publicly were queens and prostitutes. Barbe-Nicole's dad, Nicholas, was a very aware dude and very politically savvy, and he immediately declared himself as someone who was pro-democracy. And it worked because he was accepted by the revolutionaries, and he even joined the radical group, the Jacobins, and he represented his city to the new National Assembly. He actually prospered during the revolution and was able to safeguard his family's fortune and property. Although we don't have much personal information about Barbe-Nicole, we do have a sense of what she looked like at around the age of 16 from her identification papers, which list her as 4.5 feet tall, gray eyes, and, quote, ardent blonde hair. Mazzeo adds that she was not conventionally pretty and tended to be chubby. There are also a couple surviving portraits of her later on in life, so we have a good sense of what she looked like. In a fun little familial foreshadowing history, she was named after her maternal grandmother, Marie Barbe-Nicole Huert Laterte, who had been born a Renard. Marie's dad, which would be Barbe Nicole's great grandfather, was Nicolas Renoir, who was famous for champagne. Stay with me here. So, this guy was the nephew of the monk Dom Thierry Renoir, who was friends and a collaborator with none other than Dom Perrier Perignon. The story goes that before Perignon died, he passed on his winemaking secrets to Thierry, who passed them on to Nicholas, and Nicholas ends up founding the world's first champagne house in 1729. Mazzeo writes, quote, Barbe Nicole's great-grandfather had invented the industry that she would someday revolutionize, end quote. Barbe Nicole got married at age 20 to one of her dad's friend's son, Francois Clicquot. While this may not have been a forced arranged marriage, it was the daughter's duty to kind of marry whoever the dad told her to. And the marriage was definitely an advantageous business arrangement. The dad's friend, Philippe, was also a wealthy merchant in the textile industry, like her dad, but also had a small side hustle in the wine trade business. Although they owned some vineyards, the business was mostly selling wine that others had made. But Francois was interested in the winemaking side of the business. He seemed to be a good pick, and he was described as handsome, played the violin well, and had a liberal education. But he was also prone to mood swings and depression. I mean, same girl. Francois had been able to avoid combat duty due to Philippe pulling some strings and probably some well-placed bribes. He was his parents' only son, so there was a lot of pressure to keep him safe and alive in order for him to take over his dad's businesses when the time came. So Francois and Barbe Nicole got married in a secret Catholic ceremony in a cellar, and maybe it was a wine cellar. We don't really know. This was because the practice of religion was officially ended in 1794, and the Catholic rites were deemed criminal. Later, the families filed the required secular contract, which shows they were married June 10th, 1798. Now, Mazzeo goes into great detail about champagne, how it's made, all the nitty-gritty wine enthusiast stuff like the soil, climate, etc. I'm not going to go into those details, but some of the history of the evolution of champagne I found interesting, and I'll share those so we can get a sense of what the champagne business would have been like for the newly married Francois and Barbe Nicole. First, the most interesting thing that the name champagne didn't really catch on until the 1860s in France. Francois and Barbe Nicole would have referred to it as a vin mousseux or just sparkling wine. The other big thing is that the sparkling wine champagne would have been almost unrecognizable today. It was most popular as a dessert wine and sometimes served so cold it was kind of like a wine slushy. And it was also way, 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 way more sweeter than even the sweetest champagnes that we have today. A bottle would have around 200 grams of sugar, and it was a little bit more of an earthy rose look to it. And sadly for the French, sorry guys, wine historians are now claiming that champagne didn't even originate in France. Woo, some fighting words, but rather in Britain, where there was already a small market for it by the 1660s. And again, sorry to the French. The legend of Dom Perignon, quote, inventing champagne is really just from a good marketing campaign in the late 1800s. During his time, Dom Perignon was actually tasked with figuring out how to get rid of the bubbles that they were finding in the wine because they were unwanted. Although the whole British invented champagne is still controversial, and there's evidence for each country having made sparkling wine a long time ago, it's all good, you guys. Don't fight. But I do think it's funny that Britain can claim inventing it when the rules for champagne are so strict, like it can only be called champagne if it's made in the wine region of Champagne, France. Um, so keep fighting about it, I guess. Not long after they were married, Napoleon Bonaparte overthrew the French government and a new turbulent period in France began. Barbe Nicole gives birth to a daughter named Clementine after her mother and sister, around the same time as Napoleon taking over. But there was a peace treaty signed in 1801, and Francois wanted to capitalize on this moment, so he began work as an international traveling wine salesman. He would be gone for months, so it's not hard to imagine that Barbe Nicole kept an eye on the business in the vineyards while he was away. It was while Francois was traveling that he met a man named Louis Bonnet, Bone, Bohne. Again, I'm so sorry for all these French pronunciations. He was another traveling salesman. He was said to be portly with red hair and very enthusiastic about Francois's emerging wine business, so they started working together. And Louis would become a very, very important player in the Clicquot champagne business. Although Louis was able to procure a decent amount of sales, the harvest of 1802 was disastrous. It got really, really hot and the vines shriveled up, and this went on for the next 3 years, so they couldn't really even make wine and therefore no money. Despite all this, Francois still really wanted to get into the actual winemaking business. He seemed to like big stakes, and when everything was going wrong around him, he wanted to go all in. But he unfortunately did not have good timing. Champagne break. Okay. It seems that Francois kept Barbe Nicole in the loop about the winemaking business and may have even bounced ideas off of her. It was said that him and his dad Philippe didn't have the best of relationships, and so he probably didn't really turn to his dad for advice. So, it would make sense that he would turn to his wife. Family legend says that she would accompany him to the vineyards and she would sit for hours watching the laborers pick the grapes. It would take a year for them to come up with their own house wines, so they'd buy casks of wine and blend them and then bottle that. And this is where the magic happened. And this is what Barbe Nicole excelled at, and she was the one who actually blended the Clicquot wines in Champagne. By 1804, their sales in France were down to 7% from 25% just a few years earlier. But they were still doing modestly well, and their first house wines were available to sell. Louis was able to secure some sales from dukes and princes in Prussia and Austria. But that peace treaty that we just talked about had unraveled, so they couldn't really sell to Great Britain. So, Francois, in another enthusiastic move, wanted to try to get into the Russian market. And so off Louis went, but it was not a very successful trip. They barely had any sales, and international trade got worse by the week as hostilities intensified. And then the year 1805 brought another year of bad weather, which led to almost no harvest. Things were looking pretty bleak, not only for their wine business, but for their country as a whole. Then in October of that year, Francois contracted an infectious fever, what we would now call typhoid, and he died soon after that, leaving Barbe Nicole a widow and a single mother at just 27 years old. So this is the usual telling of how he died, but there were rumors around the town that he had actually died by suicide. Now, there isn't any direct evidence for actually either version of his death, although letters sent to Francois by his dad show him having concerns about his son's tendency towards gloom and melancholy. And things weren't going well with his business, so I guess we'll truly never know. But either way, it's a tragic loss, and he himself was only 31, and he left behind a wife and daughter. So either way, it's very, very sad. So, when Louis gets back to Reims after hearing of the news of Francois's death, he and Barbe Nicole kind of seem to be in agreement that they're going to keep the business going. But first, they had to convince her father-in-law, Philippe. Now, Philippe allowed her to keep the business going as long as she signed on a male partner, which was one of his friends who was also a winemaker by the name of Alexander Fourneau. And this was an agreement over a 4 year period. And while this wasn't the norm in the day, Mazzeo talks about how this time period was a big transition from how businesses operated. It was unusual for a woman to own or be in charge of a business, but it wasn't uncommon for women in general to participate or work for a family-run business. And that's kind of how things were at the time, was things were mostly ran by families. She took over her late husband's wine business just at the right time because right afterwards, industrialization of business and large scale manufacturing really take off, and that actually severely impacts small family run businesses, which almost completely removes any working women that were in the picture. Her dad and father-in-law, even though they were very successful and wealthy, they were from the time of knowing women to participate in family business. Mazzeo also wonders if Philippe, her father-in-law, wanted to keep the business alive as a way to keep part of his son alive. Barbe-Nicole and Alexander invest 80,000 francs into the partnership, which is about 80 times the salary of one of their entry-level salesmen. The partnership also included all of Philippe's wine inventory. Although it's hard to definitively translate francs from this time period to modern currency, it's estimated that this partnership had about $4 million in capital to start. Another sadly ironic positive to come out of her husband dying was that now Barbe-Nicole could own and operate her late husband's business. A married woman during that time in France would have had pretty much no rights to any property or running any businesses. But there was kind of a loophole or a caveat that a widow could actually gain rights and a lot of autonomy. So this is why during this time, there's actually a few other widows running their own wine businesses. At this time, the Clicquot family also left the textile business, and by 1806, 75% of their wine sales were crafted by them, which was way more than the business ever did under Francois. They had some beginner's luck, and they were able to sell about 50,000 bottles, which is $3 million worth of product, but they did so by defying Napoleon's new trade restrictions. They were able to get the shipment to the ports of Amsterdam, where it would sail off to different European countries. But unfortunately, this is where their luck ran out. They were just a bit too late to the port, and a blockade on Amsterdam went into place before they could get their shipment out of Amsterdam. So they had to sit there and wait and hope that the champagne would survive long enough until the blockade was lifted. But the summer came and went, and it was very, very hot. And when they were finally able to get someone in to check on the shipment in October, most of the bottles had gone bad. Most of the bottles had gone bad, and it was a major loss for the new company. Louis went back out to Russia to try and get some sales, but he was quickly deemed a French spy by the Russians, and it became a very dangerous place for him to be. Although the ironic thing is, Veuve Clicquot wines were kind of in high demand in Russia by 1808. And for a few short months when the blockade was lifted, Louis was able to head back to Russia and make some sales. This didn't last long, though, and by the spring of 1809, everything went to shit again. The blockades went back up. Europe as a whole was close to financial collapse, and in 1810, Napoleon required all exports to have an expensive government license, and shortly after that, banks all over Europe began to fail. And this was the same year that her partnership with Alexander ended, and he had no intention of staying on. And this was partly due to his son becoming of business age, and he wanted to give his separate wine business to his son and teach him. So that makes sense. But you could say it's safe to say things for Barbe-Nicole and her wine business were not looking good. She lost her partner, his money, inventory. They lost all that inventory in Amsterdam. And this kind of like hot and cold with like Europe being in war, blockades, no blockades, peace treaty, no peace treaty. It was not great for honestly anyone living in France at that time. It was a little sketchy. It was a little rough. But her dad, Nicholas, was doing quite well for himself. As I said, he was quite the politician and knew how to present himself in the best way. He was now the mayor of Reims through royal declaration by Napoleon himself. So, he was able to, be pro-democracy to avoid the mob killing him. And then when Napoleon took over, he was like, never mind, I'm actually like a super cool royalist. Once Barbe-Nicole became the sole owner of the business, she was heavily involved with it and worked long hours. She sent her daughter to a convent boarding school, just like she had gone to. And maybe it was out of tradition, but her busy work schedule could have been another reason to send her daughter off. So now she was alone in her home running a wine company by herself. Because most of her money was probably tied up in the business and it wasn't doing so well, she asked one of her salesmen to try to sell some of her family jewelry. But like I said, times were tough for everyone and not a lot of people were really looking for fine jewelry because they couldn't afford it. Sadly, most people were just trying to survive and find food and shelter for their families. So she ended up being able to keep most of her jewelry, but it seemed like she might have been a little bit short on cash. But I mean, we don't really need to feel that bad for her, I don't think, because she still had multiple properties, vineyards, and a business, even if it wasn't doing so well. Plus, her dad was very wealthy and now the mayor, and her father-in-law, Philippe, was also a very wealthy merchant. So I don't think she was ever really in danger of becoming homeless or anything like that. She would tell her salesman to do whatever necessary to get the sales, even if it meant lowering the price. But there was not much any of them could do. The blockades and counter blockades were heavily enforced, and so many people were not doing financially, like we said, that they could even afford to buy fancy wines or champagnes. And to top off bad news with even more bad news, the harvest of 1811 was one of the best harvests in a very long time. It was one of two best vintages of the century. This year was marked by a brilliantly bright comet, and a lot of winemakers use this comet as their cork mark. Some people believed it was a sign of change and the end of Napoleon's reign. Because so much good wine was made with this harvest, it drove the wine prices down even further. But even that did not make wine affordable to most people. So Barb Nicole did what she could to save as much of the harvest as she possibly could, and that meant using a lot of the cast wines to make champagne. This solved the problem of not wasting the wine because the champagne had to sit for a year, but that also didn't really help the cash flow problem. And in 1812, Napoleon starts his invasion of Russia, and Russia in turn bans French wines, putting the final nail in the coffin for Barbe Nicole and her fellow winemakers. She had to lay off her entire sales team except for Louis. The future of her wine business and her country were uncertain to say the least. From 1805, when Francois died and she took over, to 1813, sales of her wine were down 80%. And then, so a little back, so all of this wine is, the wine business is happening with the backdrop of the war. And so let's just talk about that a little bit because, although this is very interesting, people were people were dying, Kim. Nearly 500,000 French soldiers were sent into Russia, but only 30,000 made it home. Many died of disease, malnourishment, and freezing temperatures. This meant that they needed more men, so more recruitment and taxes came for the average citizens. Nicholas, Barbe Nicole's dad, being the mayor of Reims and a royalist, was part of the delegation to help raise more troops. And for this, he was rewarded with a noble title of Chevalier or Knight, and proudly wore the star of the French Legion of Honor. He and his delegation were able to get another 500,000 men for the war. And then most of that 500,000 people were killed in a single battle called the Battle of Leipzig. And then they were chased out of Russia. And when they finally reached France, there was only 60,000 men left to defend France. By early 1814, the war was at Barbe-Nicole's doorstep. She could hear the cannons off in the distance, but they were getting closer. She decided to pull her daughter out of the convent, most likely remembering when she was pulled out of her school at the start of the first revolution. Her daughter Clementine was now 13 or 14, and I just can't help but think how sad it was for both of them to have to go through such violent and scary times. It was such a turbulent time in France. It was probably like a horrific sense of deja vu for Barb Nicole. Napoleon had once said Champagne would make a great battlefield, and it looked like that might come true. Barbe-Nicole was fearful of her cellars being looted. If that happened, it would be the end of her wine business, basically. In a letter she wrote to relatives about her fear of being looted, she wrote, I would not regret my losses except for my poor child, for whom it would have been better if this misfortune had come 5 or 6 years earlier, because then she would never have known any of the pleasures that she will lose, and which will make her miserable. But I will struggle to do without everything, to sacrifice everything, everything so that she will be less unhappy. And although we do not have much of her thoughts or letters, what we do have is a pretty clear picture that she fiercely loved her daughter and wanted to be successful so that she could have a good life. And not to mention, if the French were defeated, her father would probably be in danger of being killed or taken prisoner. The city of Reims was very lucky, however, while other parts of France and Champagne were looted and destroyed by the Allied troops. The Russians that came into Reims were gentlemanly and were ordered not to loot. This order came from the Russian prince leading this army, Sergei Alexandrovich Volkonsky. In an ironic twist of fate, the occupying Russian army would actually buy her champagne. The champagne that Louis and the other salesmen had tried so hard to sell in Russia. And essentially, the Russians were now at her doorstep buying the wine. She saw this as a great market opportunity. And Jean-Remy Moet had his wine cellars looted, but even he recognized it would help him in the long run because he knew his wines were good. He said, quote, all these officers who ruin me today will make my fortune tomorrow. All those who drink my wine are salesmen who, on returning to their own country, will make the product famous, end quote. And I mean, he was right. All of the wine was said to have helped the French recapture Reims in 1814 because a lot of the Russians were drunk. The French then celebrated their victory with the local champagne, and this is where the origin of the sabrage was said to have begun. This is when you open the champagne bottle with a sword. And they did this because they couldn't hold a glass while opening a bottle while they were on their horses. But then it's a little backseat forces. Reims goes back under Russian control a few weeks later, and Napoleon is determined to take it back. He sends word to Nicholas, Barbe-Nicole's dad, that he's coming their way and he wants to stay with him. Ever the cognizant politician, Nicholas could see the writing on the wall, and the Russians and their allies were closing in. Napoleon's time seemed to be limited, and Nicholas didn't want to be seen hosting him, just in case a new group came to power. So he literally skips town on business and doesn't come back until things are squared away. He sends a note to Napoleon being like, "Oh man, I really wish I could be there to host you, but I'm actually gonna be out of town, so whoopsies, I'll catch you later." And then he leaves Barbe-Nicole to be the one that hosts and entertains the emperor. Seems kind of fucked up to me, and very selfish. If he was so worried about his image and, property and wealth, but he wasn't worried about his daughters. But in the end, she was very lucky and suffered no losses to her cellars or damage to her vineyards. And in 1814, Napoleon abdicates the throne in early April. Now, some people in Barbe-Nicole's position, having made it through the war unscathed, both personally and in regards to her business, would lay low. Wait for things to settle down and start back up when peace treaties are signed, trade agreements are reestablished. But that's not how you become the biggest champagne seller in the game now, is it? So what does Barb Nicole do? So what she does is that she, like her husband, bets big on herself. She knows her champagne is good and that people want it. And so she starts getting a shipment ready before the peace treaty is even signed. She knows that she's going to have to be the first person out on the market to be the best. She's got to beat out all the champagne competitors. You know, it was basically a race across Europe who could get their champagne out there first. So she arranges a shipment of her champagne, gets it going. And I mean, it's pretty ballsy considering the last time she tried to do this in Amsterdam and it completely failed. But she's like, you know what? Never give up. I'm going to do it again. And she was actually successful. She got to Russia and other parts of Europe first, and her champagne sold like crazy. Louis actually um, traveled to Russia in the cargo ship with the wine, and he began selling it like as soon as he gets there. And she was right, everyone wants her champagne. You know, honestly, from there, the rest is history. She is so bold and sure of herself that before she even knows whether or not this first shipment makes it with Louis to Russia, she already has a second batch ready to go. And she has that shipped out. And, you know, maybe the turn of bad luck, she was due for some good luck, but that shipment makes it fine and she gets to sell all of that. And within a year, she was running a world-renowned commercial empire. And let's not forget that she was not only running the company, but she was also still blending the wines herself. And by the 1820s, she was exporting around 175,000 bottles a year. But not everything was such smooth sailing. She ends up marrying off her daughter. It's kind of interesting. She seems to have a more traditional gender normed mind when it comes to her daughter. You know, maybe since she was kind of defying the times that she would maybe want her daughter to do the same thing and maybe even take over for her. But that does not seem to be the case. She tries to find an eligible suitor for her daughter. But she kind of seems to have a weakness for attractive young men, let's be honest. And she ends up marrying off her daughter to a man named Louis Comte de Chevigny, who was a gambler who was constantly asking for money. But people said that she was infatuated with him. This part of the book really pissed me off because he sounded like such a dick, and yet she never said no to him. He was clearly marrying for the money, and he wrote to a friend that he wanted the riches that came with marrying Clementine and that it was, quote, easy living for the time being and opulence in the future, end quote, because he knew that Clementine was the only child and that he would inherit the champagne business. He did come from a noble background, but his entire family was killed in the revolution, so maybe she felt bad for him, but still, that doesn't really excuse his behavior. He goes, and the other weird thing about him is that he goes on to write like really explicit, raunchy poetry, which is presumed to be about his new wife, Clementine. And so Clicquot would do her best to try to buy up all of these copies of the poems that she could find, and he would end up printing several editions of this type of poetry, and she basically just kept buying them up. And she was kind of, in a way, backing him financially, in a way. I don't know if he really knew that she was doing that, but she also bought him and her daughter several large estates, built them even bigger, fancier chateaus, and he was a big financial drink. So he would ask for even more money on top of that. She at least had the wherewithal, thank God, to keep Clementine and her husband from inheriting the company. While she was deciding who would be the one to take over, her two biggest mentors, her dad and her father-in-law, pass away within months of each other. So she couldn't ask for their opinion. And this seemed to be pretty impactful on her. The obvious choice would be Louis Bonnet, the guy that was basically the right-hand man since Francois started the business. But he had also tragically passed away. From all his crazy adventures around the world, he sadly died from falling off an icy bridge. Another maybe not so great decision was that she got back into the textile business with a guy named George who kind of like ran these operations. But times had changed and the textile mills were more mechanized, and she had to rely on this business partner to kind of run the operation because it was not local and because it was not his own money. George didn't really care and took a lot more like risks than probably Barbe-Nicole would have. And she ended up losing a lot of money. Within a few years, she was $14 million in the red. And she ended this partnership, and the guy, George, got to keep the mills. She also tried coming up with her own bank for winemakers, but that also backfired. A newer employee to the company, Edouard Worley, sorry again for the pronunciations. More about him in a second. He's the only reason that she was able to keep her champagne business going, honestly. A depression in the 1820s caused a bank run that Clicquot didn't have the cash on hand to deal with. She was out in the countryside, so Edouard used his own personal finances to pay off the people trying to collect at her bank. He had to rush 90 miles to Paris to get the money, which was 2 million francs, equivalent to $44 million today, everyone. This guy. And he had to drive the 90 miles back. I mean, on horseback, not driving a car. In the same night, otherwise, Clicquot would have been forced to liquidate her champagne business. His bank gave them 1 million in francs in cash and then a line of credit for the other million. And this was enough to placate the worried investors, and the bank run ended with Clicquot only losing about $5.5 million in total, which I mean is a lot, but she was able to keep her business. So shout out to Edward. So now for a little bit of chisme, a little gossip. So one of her employees by the name of George Christian von Kessler, the local gossip suggested that Barb Nicole had a habitual weakness for handsome young men. So the question of who should take over the company comes back up around 1829 or 1821, sorry, and she announces that it's going to be this George guy. Everyone is shocked, but at the same time not so shocked because it kind of gives credence to the rumors. So there were, people thought, oh, well, she must be sleeping with this young hot employee if she's gonna let him take over the whole business. But then a year later, a hot new bombshell enters the villa in the form of a handsome 20-year-old upstarter named Edward Worley. So that's where he comes in. He's the hot new bombshell. And it's Barb Nicole, just for the record, is in her mid 40s at this time. So she, I think, might have liked being a cougar. It's shortly after Edward arrives that she revokes her promise to give George the company. And that really just keeps the rumor mill going of like, oh, yep, now she's with Edward. She dumped George. And soon Edward was her constant companion around the cellars and vineyards. And she kind of put the thought of who was going to succeed her in the back burner because she kind of wanted to focus on recouping her losses and getting back to the business of champagne, which had made her all this money in the first place. She ends up retiring in the 1840s when she's in her early to mid 60s. But for her, that just means she takes longer vacations in the winter, but she still is quite involved in running the business. Eventually, she does agree to let Edouard take over as director, and they had a couple of partners. By this time, her name was synonymous with champagne, with people asking for a bottle of the Widow, and it was popping up in a lot of the century's greatest works of literature. She tries to enjoy the retirement life and be a grandmother and a great grandmother, but she can't shake the workaholic in her, so she picks up a new hobby, of buying and decorating new houses because she has a shit ton of money by this time. As she resumes a more traditional role for women at that time, she begins to fade back into that anonymity. Mazzeo puts it well, saying, she returned, at least in outward appearances, to the traditional role of the 19th century lady. With this departure from the public sphere of business, her life, as extraordinary and celebrated as it had been, fades back into the shadowy realms of unrecorded history. The name, of course, continued. Everyone still knew the wine of the widow Clicquot, but there were few who recorded their intimate impressions of the woman. End quote. She lives to see the coup of Louis Napoleon in 1848 and the Industrial Revolution. By this time, Edouard was worth about $8 to $10 billion in today's money, and then he kind of does the same thing as her dad, and he becomes the mayor of Reims. And Barbe-Nicole obviously has much, much more money than that, if you can believe it. In her later years, she donates about $2 million in today's money to build a home for the poor children, and she raised money to save historical sites around Reims. And when the city's water supply ran dry, she opened up access to a spring that was on her private property. She joked that her competitors would be using her water to rinse their champagne bottles. And a fun little side story, Louis Napoleon, aka Napoleon III, didn't really like the sweet champagne that everyone was making at the time. He actually preferred the dry champagne because he had lived in Britain and that's what was popular there. And this opened up an opportunity for a newly widowed woman named Louise Pomeray. And she decided to take over her late husband's business, late husband's wine business, and she was determined to capture the British market. Sound familiar? She had very she had many similarities to Barbe-Nicole, and she took a fledgling company and turned it into one of the most popular, selling over 1 million bottles a year, more than Widow Clicquot ever produced, or more than Widow Clicquot produced at the time. Mazzeo notes that Pomery was more like Barbe-Nicole's heir than her own daughter. In Barbe-Nicole's later years, she was known to host and entertain, it seems like anyone who would show up at her house. It was said that there were constantly writers, artists, princes, and politicians coming to her house. Barbe-Nicole dies in July of 1866 at the age of 89. She was remembered in death as the uncrowned Queen of Reims. Barbe-Nicole is credited with three achievements: internationalizing the champagne market, establishing brand identification, and a term called remue sur pupitre. Sorry, everyone, which translates to moving by desk. And it's this last achievement which made her so famous in winemaking history. And so that's basically, at the time, they were having a really hard time getting the byproducts out of the champagne bottles. After the second fermentation, there'd be a lot of the leftover and dead yeast and all the other little clumped up stuff. And they had really no good way of getting it out. And so she came up with a way where she cut holes, angled holes into a table, and then you would put the champagne bottle neck first to rest at an angle on this table. And then after some time, all the solids in the champagne bottle would solidify a little bit more and it would rest right where the cork was. So all you had to do is quickly remove the cork. That little ball of yuckies would pop right out and you recork it real fast. And you would not waste a lot of champagne. And it was very easy, and you could just make huge tables for this. And that's an invention that Barbe-Nicole came up with. Now, there is a movie on, I don't remember, I'd have to look it up, but there is a movie called The Widow Clicquot, and I think it's loosely based off this book, but I thought I would share my 2 cents for it. It's a good movie if you want to be entertained. I do not think it is a very historically accurate portrayal of Barbe-Nicole's life. And it was a little disappointing because it seemed to be a movie more about her husband than about her and all of the amazing things that she did during her lifetime. So that was kind of a bummer. We just talked about her entire life, so I don't know if these are going to be spoilers. But if you do want to watch the movie and you don't want to hear me talk about it, I would skip the next couple minutes. So the first thing is they portray Francois as being bi, which is not a problem, but that he had an affair with Louis Bon, his salesman, which there's no historical evidence for him either being bi or having affairs with men or women. And that just kind of seemed to be weird, like unnecessary. I mean, obviously, that's why I said this movie is good for entertainment because that does add they had to add a lot of drama to for this movie. And so that's one of the ways they did it. And then after Francois dies, Barb Nicole has an affair with Louis as well. And although Mazzeo writes that Barb Nicole may have been having affairs with either Edouard or some of the other young men that worked for her, there's no proof for any of this. Some historians suggest that Clicquot actually stayed a widow her entire life just for the sole reason that because of all the stupid laws, that was the only way for her to be independent and run a business. She could have been in love, and she just chose not to officially ever marry anyone. So, who knows? But it's probably not with Louis, no offense to him. He was not a hot young man. And in the movie, they do say that Francois died by suicide, but again, we kind of talked about that. Who really knows? The movie also portrays the family as being kind of poor the whole time, and there's scenes where like she has to sell like all this furniture and like homes and stuff. But like I said, I don't think she was struggling as much as the movie portrays, but again, they need some drama. And then also she was never brought to trial by Moet. Sorry, I'm not a champagne person, so I don't know how to pronounce that. Know it's very popular, even though they were very competitive with each other, and there's no record of Louis ever proposing to her. I think the trial was a way to kind of show the rules and how she kind of like got away with owning her own business by being a widow. But yeah, I read the book first, and so I kind of knew the biography, and I was pretty disappointed by the movie. I'm not gonna lie. So to wrap it up, I have some final thoughts. Barb Nicole transformed the way champagne was made, sold, and marketed. She defied gender norms and roles and took a floundering champagne house and turned it into one of the most well-known brands to this day. She set up her future generations for success and did what she thought was best for her family. Even with all this fame and wealth, there is so much about her personality and personal life that we do not know. None of her diaries, if she even kept one, do not exist today, and there aren't many surviving letters of hers. And I think that's one of the reasons she is so fascinating to me. There are still so many questions left unanswered about this famous Veuve Clicquot. And maybe that is because in her time, at the end of the day, she was still just a woman, regardless of her business success. So it wasn't really deemed important to save any of her personal items. For me personally, one of the biggest takeaways I got from reading Barb Nicole's story is to never give up and always believe in yourself. There were so many points in her life that she could have taken the easy road and lived, the high society life expected of a well-off woman. She could have just hosted dinner parties and salons where the most fashionable clothing and promenade around the lake, but she didn't. Even the fact that she fought to run her husband's wine business after his death is such a bold move, but she never stopped. She knew that she was capable of so much more than just cross-stitching in a drawing room. She believed in herself, in her intelligence, when almost no one else did. And even when things weren't going well, she still bet on herself and took daring steps to sell her champagne. She persevered through so much personal heartbreak, all the while surviving some of the most tumultuous times in French history. And not only did she survive, she thrived. And her legacy continues on. Her yellow label champagne with her name on it is still world famous. With that being said, I'd like to end with some words from Barb Nicole that we do have. They have stayed with me, and I hope you find them as inspirational as I do. They come from the last few years of her life in a letter that she wrote to her great-granddaughter. Quote, "I am going to tell you a secret. You more than anyone resemble me. You who have so much audacity. It is a precious quality that has been very useful to me in the course of my long life, to dare things before others. I am called today the Grand Lady of Champagne. Look around you, this chateau, these unfaltering hills. I can be bolder than you realize. The world is in perpetual motion, and we must invent things of tomorrow. One must go before others. Be determined and exacting, and let your intelligence direct your life. Act with audacity. Perhaps you too will be famous. End quote. So that's all I have for you. Here's to Barbe-Nicole Clicquot, and I hope that you all let your intelligence guide you and to act with audacity. I'll see you next week. Cheers.